Welcome to this week's episode of the Manage to Track podcast. This week, I am excited to introduce a special guest to you. Her name is Melody Wilding, and she is actually on the publication date of this episode, she will launch her book, Managing Up: How to Get What You Need from the People in Charge. Now, I've known Melody for a while, and I've observed her work and seen her in action. She's one of those people that is very thoughtful, very smart, very knowledgeable, and has an arsenal of experience supporting professionals as they advance in their careers. She focuses specifically on helping high achieving professionals who are also feeling a lot and emotionally aware. And through her work, she identified 10 critical conversations to have with your manager or other senior leaders in the organization to help you create an environment that's conducive to your success. And this is what this podcast episode is going to be about. We're going to dive into setting boundaries. We're going to talk about how to have career advancement conversations or ask for a raise, and so much more. So you're in for a treat. And I also highly recommend that if managing up is a topic that you're interested in, go check out the show notes and look for the link to grab her book. If all goes as planned, it will be available on Amazon starting March 4th of 2025. Without further ado, let's welcome Melody to the podcast. Here are the 2 questions this podcast answers. 1, how do you successfully transition into your first official leadership role? And 2, how do you keep climbing that leadership ladder and continuously get promoted, although the competition and the expectations get bigger? This show, the Manage to Track podcast, will provide the answers. I'm your host, Ramona Shaw. I'm on a mission to create workplaces where work is seen as a source of contribution, connection, and personal fulfillment. And this transition starts with developing a new generation of leaders who know how to lead so everyone wins and grows. In this show, you'll learn how to think, communicate, and act as a confident and competent leader you know you can be. Melody, it's so good to have you back on the Manage to Track podcast. Thank you for joining us in a time that's very busy for you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So we're going to talk about a really important topic. Managing up is something that comes up a lot in your world as a coach, as well as in my world with leaders that we both support day in and day out. In your book, you define managing up as strategically navigating relationships with those in power. Now, that all sounds fairly simple, but we both know that there is pushback that we sometimes receive to the suggestion to manage up effectively. And sometimes it's because people don't want to manage up or don't think that they should have to manage up. What do you say to people who are hesitant with the idea of embracing the topic and the skill?
Yeah, I think a lot of the resistance we have to the idea is because we are thinking of an outdated version of managing up. We think about that person who is the suck up, who knows the boss's coffee order or is laughing at their terrible jokes. And we think, and I hear this from people, I'm sure you do too, that I don't want to be the suck up. I don't want to have to ingratiate myself. I don't want to play politics. I want to do good work and I want that to be enough. And here's the thing, we'll talk in a second about how that's actually not what managing up is at the end of the day. But you also have to realize that when you are not doing this skill set, when you are not leaning into this and seeing the workplace as it is, where we have to navigate human dynamics and the power dynamics around us, you end up creating more of what you don't want. You end up creating more frustration because your ideas are going to continue to get overlooked. You feel even more anxious about speaking up in meetings, or there's more opportunities passing you by. And when we talk about, as you said, my definition of managing up is very simply navigating relationships with the people above you, primarily your boss, but also others. And at the end of the day, this is not something you do for your boss's benefit. It's not something you do to please them. It's something you do to create the conditions for your own success. And I think that's a really important mindset shift because when we think of managing up as me getting what I need, from the people in charge, whether that is clearer direction or prioritization, being able to give people feedback and it's actually heard and acted on, then we're more so creating the conditions for our success to be happier, more productive.
I love how you phrase this with really emphasizing the importance of creating conditions for us to be successful at at our job. Now, when it comes to influencing others, and I'm gonna kind of get really into this fairly quickly on or fairly early on here. What are some of the mistakes that people make as they're trying to influence others, especially those people with power?
Yes. I think the number one thing I see, because I tend to work with people that are more sensitive and emotionally aware, is that they take other people's behavior personally.
Mhm.
And why this is a mistake is because we often think that someone is being difficult when in fact it really comes down to a difference in communication style, preferences, approach. And so the book is constructed around these 10 conversations to manage up. We can talk more about that. But one of the conversations is called the styles conversation. And the idea behind that is that everyone you work with, including you, we all have a general operating system to how we approach interactions. And when you can understand that your default may be to be someone who leads with more context or cares really a lot about the people involved, getting consensus, who's on board, who's not, you're much more people oriented in your approach, but you can recognize I'm dealing with a manager who is much more task oriented to the point, just wants the bottom line. You're going to eliminate a ton of frustration for yourself. And instead of taking it personally when they give you a two-word email response, you're going to realize, okay, that's their style. They move quickly, and a quick acknowledgement from them is enough to move ahead. I don't have to take that personally that do they hate me? Are they upset with this idea? I know who I'm dealing with.
Mhm. It's interesting. I often hear this sort of taking things personally come up also when people receive pushback or receive feedback. And that's a big differentiator between those who persevere and form strong relationships with people in power versus those who always feel like this is hard, challenging, don't like to play politics and sort of withdraw from those conversations because it hurts too much, right? It feels too intense or too difficult to do.
Yeah, and this is where emotional intelligence is your number one advantage when it comes to managing up. And that's why I say it's not about playing politics and being conniving and Machiavellian. It's not about being a blowhard who is just, self-promoting from the rooftops and is all talk and no value. Really, to be a master at managing up, you have to be someone who reads between the lines, who is willing to listen to other people, who is very observant and is cares about other people's needs and desires and goals. And the strategic part comes in using that information to then make your communication and your approach, your actions more effective so that if you can frame your idea, maybe you do care more about the people involved, but you know your boss is a more results oriented person. Well, instead of saying, this is who we have on board with this already, you can explain, this is how this is going to help us double the or rather decrease the amount of time for us to deliver this project. You're much more likely to get through and get a result with that person, which benefits everyone. It benefits you, it benefits your manager, it benefits the organization.
Absolutely. So in your book, you talk about these conversations. Which of those conversations do you think people struggle with the most?
Yeah. I already talked about styles. I think that one can be not necessarily one that people struggle with, but definitely one people overlook. But I think where people have the most trouble is, I would say, boundaries is a big one. There's an entire chapter on the boundaries conversation. And this is all about pushing back, right? How do you say no in a way that is diplomatic, tactful? Because no is not a complete sentence in the workplace. If you imagine if you were to say just, no, can't do that to your manager, very few of us could actually do that. And have our relationship be the same, right? You have
Right.
to strike this balance of being a team player while not being a pushover. And so I think that's one of the hardest lines to walk.
What suggestions do you have for people to do that well?
Yes. So in that chapter, I give a menu options of different strategies you can use. You first have to understand, what is my leverage to be able to say no, the amount of times I can, and how forcefully or how assertively I can say no. So in the book, I call this your pushback power. And most people overlook this, right? I'm sure we've all had that one junior person who thinks they have a lot more leverage to push back than they actually do, right? That's an example of not understanding your pushback power. And so it means taking into account things like your tenure, the strength of your relationship with your manager, the state of the organization. If the organization is in crisis and free fall, then there's going to be less tolerance for exceptions and pushback versus when the team or the organization's in relative stability and calm.
Mhm.
And so if your pushback power is on the lower side, two of my favorite tactics for this, one is the conditional yes. And the conditional yes is saying, I'm happy to do this time because I know this is urgent or it's important, but I hope we can recognize this is an exception, or I won't always be able to accommodate this type of timeline. Or even something like, again, happy to pitch in here. Could we sit down and make sure we have a process for these types of requests in the future? So building in some kind of system or process. So that's the first strategy, to conditional yes. The second, and the one I think is most multi use, is called the trade off approach. And that is where you say, okay, we had previously said X was our priority. Now I hear Y is important. In order to make room for Y, what would you like me to deprioritize or delegate, slow down on, hand off, whatever it is? And the
Mhm.
magic of that approach is you're being cooperative, right? You're approaching it from a problem-solving, solution-focused lens, but
Mhm.
you're also putting the decision-making power back in the other person's hands. And so when your pushback power rather is lower, then that's a great strategy because it's not you saying, well, I'm not doing this. It's you presenting a frame for the conversation. And then ultimately, they're the authority.
I think this also directly ties into your pushback power, which I really appreciate this concept, because it's very true. Not everyone has, and in not every situation do you have the same leeway to work with.
Mm.
If you have and if you demonstrate the priority offset or the opportunity costs of doing one thing versus another, and whatever else you're working on is of high priority to that said stakeholder or leader, you then, not only by highlighting this, do you use that specific system, but you also highlight or emphasize your pushback power.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And the more seasoned you get in your organization, the more leverage you have, right? And the more assertive you can be about saying no.
Another
Mhm.
challenge,
Right.
other than the boundaries, is what I often hear and you address, and I'd love to talk to get your take on this, is increasing visibility, but not being too promotional. Right? I think there is, and there's a bit of a gender dynamic to this too, based on my observations an experience where we may not feel comfortable to really highlight or showcase what we're working on unless the conditions for us to do that is perfect, right? Unless we've actually been asked and we've been told to present the results, but any other option or any other opportunity, we would feel braggy. So
Mm,
how do we increase our visibility and or boost the visibility of our work more often and not just those one-off moments when we're asked to present results?
yes, or those one-off moments where you particularly feel courageous and bold that day, right? We don't want our success to depend on feelings, which can change and are temporary. And
Mhm,
so you want to think about, how can I build visibility into, I know you talk a lot about having a leadership system,
mhm,
and I also know you talk a lot about one-on-ones.
mhm,
And in your one-on-ones with your manager, that's a perfect opportunity to build visibility into how you're running those. And so I always suggest your one-on-ones, number 1, you should lead them. And number 2, you should start with some sort of wins, milestones, accomplishments, progress, whatever you want to call it. But that's your opportunity to not just go down the status updates of here's where everything is, but to actually talk about outcomes. And if you don't have tangible outcomes, to talk your manager through here's how we're tackling challenges, here's how I'm thinking about it, my considerations, so that they have visibility into your thought process.
Mhm.
Because you need to give your manager, you need to inform your manager about what you're doing. They may not have, we're using that word visibility in a very literal sense here, especially if you're hybrid or remote, they may not know what you're doing every day. And so you need to make that aware to them. And you need to present it in such a way that they could take those updates and run it up their own chain of command, because that's how your team can get more resources or have the right people in the room where decisions are being made. And so it's not just self promotion, it's not just something you do for yourself. It's almost more of a responsibility. We have to keep our managers informed of this.
I can also
Mhm.
see how the framing there then really changes how I present something. So, for example, we know that part of managing up well means to ensure that our managers or stakeholders aren't caught off guard or are being surprised by something that we should have proactively informed them about. And so when I talk to them about, hey, I want to give you a heads up, but I want to let you know so that you're in the loop, so that we're on the same page, so that you're aware. And that kind of framing allows us to sort of weave in progress or results in a way that's geared towards, is presented in a way that's beneficial to them.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. Okay, there's one more specific topic that I wanted to briefly highlight because I don't think this gets addressed often, which is the money conversation. It, especially in a time where we might feel the company is being stretched or people are being laid off, or we can justify why we might not get an increase somewhat rationally, but at the same time, we start to feel like we're being underpaid.
Mhm.
What are some suggestions that you have for people in such situations to get out of that and to communicate?
Yeah. Well, this is great because it goes hand in hand with the visibility conversation. And a mistake I see people make is when it comes to the money conversation, we focus too much on what we've already done and using that as the justification for here's why I deserve more. I did number 1, number 2, number 3 in the last year, pay me more money. That's
Mhm.
only half of the equation. Yes, you need to focus on past accomplishments, but you also need to think about addressing what's the future ROI. If we pay you 10, 20, 50K more, what value is the organization going to get from that? And you need to put yourself in your manager's shoes because they're going to have to make that case to their own boss or to a committee or whoever it may be who's making those resourcing decisions. And so, yes, you have to say, this is what I've done, but you also have to address, this is what I would be able to do. If I was promoted from a L6 to an L7 or from a manager to a director level, I'd be able to work with these types of clients or scale the team in these ways to tackle this type of project. So, addressing both sides of those is important. And then when it comes to actually making the request, I use that terminology, I deserve it, right? And many of us come at the money conversation with that mentality. I've been here for a certain amount of time, I'm due for a raise. That may be true. And you will get a lot further if you frame your request in terms of fairness. So, using language like, I want to make sure that my compensation matches the level that I'm operating at or is commensurate with the value I'm bringing to the organization, that it, syncs up with the types of projects I'm working on. And so, using that fairness language, it triggers the human response for reciprocity. We want to feel like we're doing right by someone and we're balancing the scales versus I should give you more money because you deserve it.
Mhm. Or because you feel like you deserve it.
Yes, correct. Mhm.
Especially people who are motivated more so by, like, that by, doing the right thing or doing what's best for the business. When we come in and we present our arguments with this, "I feel like," or "I think I deserve," those arguments are often quickly shut down or neglected on that level. I love the suggestion, and I think you're spot on with saying that with noticing that there are 2 components to this, and we often justify based on what we've done in the past and ignore the fact that we have to present what we're going to do. I do see this similarly when people are interviewing or, preparing and socializing this idea of taking on a bigger role, how they're often justifying that by explaining what they've done in the past. Although what this new role requires is actually not what they've done in the past, sort of like forgetting to build that bridge and present themselves at that next level.
100%. Yes, you nailed it. And there's so much overlap between in the book I call that the advancement conversation and money. They typically go hand in hand. Sometimes they don't, but you're so right that you have to paint a picture for the people around you so they can almost see you doing that role. Don't leave, and this is where it comes back to managing up is something you do for yourself, not necessarily for other people.
Mhm.
Shape that narrative, right? Shape the perception of you. And that's a perfect example of doing that. Don't make people have to make that logical leap about, okay, so she's done these certain things in this role, but they have to go through a lot of mental energy to make that translation, make it explicit for them.
Well, so we covered a number of different conversations, and I know we only really touched on the surface. Your book is full of suggestions, frameworks, practical tips to help people and organizations become more effective at managing up. But I'd love to take a little bit of a sort of zoom out a bit and look at the topic overall. As you were writing this book and based on your experience working with hundreds, I don't know how many hundreds, but a lot of leaders in different ranks across organizations, what did you learn about managing up through this process?
It's such a good question. I think a few things. So I'm big on the phrase, you teach people how to treat you.
Mhm.
And one of my reasons for writing this book is that since the pandemic, the number of people who feel out of control at work, who feel like their future is not in their control, their relationships are out of their control, their career is out of their control. That has doubled since the pandemic. And for me, as someone who is a huge believer in personal agency and that really being one of the driving forces of satisfaction and personal happiness, it was unacceptable to me that so many people felt that way. And working with the folks that I do, I work with people that are more, again, emotionally sensitive, very perceptive. They feel jerked around by everything that's happening around them. And when you can really embrace and act on this idea that you teach people how to treat you, and when you show up differently, whether it's in your communication, a simple thing, like instead of throwing yourself under the bus with your communication to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," or "This isn't a great idea," right? You're signaling to people to not value what's going to come next. And when you cut that out, when you can speak more directly and more confidently, how people, number one, how you feel about it changes, but then how people respond to you also changes. And that's what I mean by sort of shaping the environment around you. You have so much more control than you think to influence the direction that your career takes and the relationships that you have.
Well said, and I love your motive there to provide or support people in developing their personal agency. What was something that surprised you?
A couple of things. I'm going to cheat and give you a few. Number one was that I ran across a stat that your manager has more impact on your mental health than your doctor, your therapist, and almost as much as your spouse. And that speaks to the fact that, you know, we need to learn this skill set. This is not just something you need when you have a difficult boss. This managing up is a approach, it's a stance, a more proactive stance you should have in your career regardless of who you are managing, because who you do report to could change on a dime. There could be a reorg tomorrow, your boss could leave. You may never develop a great relationship with them, although I hope you do. But we have to learn how to work with imperfect people. They will be everywhere we go. And so that was really shocking to me that um, we spend 70, 80% of our time at work, yet so many of us don't put a lot of effort and attention into being intentional about this relationship.
Yeah, and I think we spend a lot of at least leaders spend a lot of time thinking about their team, their direct reports, and how to cultivate strong relationships with them.
Mm.
And what I noticed when I asked the question, what do you appreciate that your some of your direct reports do that you really value as a leader? They would list, I want to say 90% of the times, anything that they say is what we would consider managing up. So it's what the direct report does intentionally to strengthen that relationship and to create a better, more successful environment for themselves and making it easier on the manager. And so then we look at and how much of those things, that behaviors that you appreciate, do you do with your boss? And it's often interesting to hear sort of, huh, yeah, I've never thought about that. Right? In some way or form, because when we think about leadership, so much in our mind, so much of that is defined by the relationship between me and my direct reports and how little we actually allocate to that relationship that we have with our manager.
Yes. And just to build on that for a moment, another very surprising piece of research that I came across was that in terms of internal networks in an organization, the people who were more successful and also more satisfied were people who were brokers across different parts of the organization. And I think that's important because it's easy to get very focused on your relationship with your reports and your manager and not look around more broadly and think about, am I connecting across the matrix, across departments, cross functionally? And when you can do that, when you can place yourself in that broker position of making introductions or being the person who's translating between product and engineering, two different parts of the org, you make yourself very, very valuable. And also, just in when we talk about managing up, don't let your boss be your single point of failure. Diversify who your allies, your advocates, who you have relationships with, because you may not have positional power, but you could certainly have resource or informational power. And
Mm.
I think that's very important to be aware of, because I know I've made that mistake in my career where I was so focused on just my little bubble that I didn't look up, and that came back to bite me.
Yeah. Yeah, bosses leave, so we know. Organizations change, structures change, but it can also be that our boss isn't just particularly self or advocating on our behalf in a very aware and effective way. And if we put too many eggs into that basket, we may miss an opportunity. And we can control what they do. We can try to influence, right, and to make it as easy as possible for them. But ultimately, what they decide to level or to raise up to higher ups is outside of our control. Great point. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think would be important for the audience to know?
We touched briefly on the advancement conversation, but
Mhm.
I know you have a lot of folks in your audience who do care about moving up and doing more in the organization. And I just want to say, don't fall into the performance review paradox, which is, don't wait until your performance review. That should not be the first time your manager is hearing about your aspirations. You need to start 3, 6 months in advance to plant those seeds and to have an explicit conversation around, this is where I would like to be at the end of the year. I would like to grow my team from 2 to 4 people, or I'd like to be leading these sorts of projects. What do you need to see from me to feel comfortable with me getting there? Right. And so when you do that, then it's not a surprise. Again, don't let your manager be surprised. They can account for that in their planning, and you can surface objections about your readiness, about who else may need to be involved. And so, again, start sooner rather than later. And ultimately, you'll be more successful with that.
What a great point to end this conversation. Thank you for adding that as well. We wish you all the best for your book launch. We will include the link in the show notes. As I said, I know we've only read the books and we're only really touching on a small part of it. If you want to really get good at this skill and get those practical tips from Melody, you will very much enjoy grabbing the book and reading in more detail what she shares. Thanks for being on the podcast, Melody.
Thanks for having me. And just one quick note, you were also on my podcast, and it was one of the most popular episodes. So I want to encourage everyone to listen to it because it was really about preparing yourself for the next level. So I think it's a great complement to this conversation.
Oh, awesome. Okay, we will link that in the show notes as well. Thank you for the shout out, Melody. If you enjoyed this episode, then check out 2 other awesome resources to help you become a leader people love to work with. This includes a free masterclass on how to successfully lead as a new manager. Check it out at arcova.org/masterclass. The second resource is my best-selling book, The Confident and Competent New Manager: How to Quickly Rise to Success in Your First Leadership Role. Check it out at arcova.org/books or head on over to Amazon and grab your copy there. You can find all those links in the show notes down below.